The world of Oblivion is its greatest asset, its greatest strength. When Bethesda is able to leverage the world they had created to drive the gameplay experience, the game hits its true stride. When they sacrifice the world or sideline it for something else, relying on the gameplay mechanics to pick up the slack, the player experience ends up suffering. If you think I was too harsh and nitpicky with my previous video, then you'll find this time around I'm more forgiving, because we're going to be looking at what I think Oblivion does quite well for the most part. Like anything else when discussing Oblivion, there's examples of brilliance and examples of sheer boneheaded design, sloppy compromise, or things that just didn't mesh with the final product very well. Fortunately, a lot of Oblivion's game world falls into the positive column, though. The world did a lot to captivate me as a young lad, and I will admit it was more effective because I didn't really know any better and hadn't quite experienced anything like it before. But to give credit where credit is due, it's an immense world handcrafted by a team of about 30 people, and the fact that what they created still holds up pretty well by 2020 standards is a testament to the skill Bethesda possesses when it comes to creating worlds. But enough stalling, let's get into this thing. When Oblivion first launched, it was technically considered a launch title for the Xbox 360, and when compared to other games at that time, Oblivion actually looked really good. When compared to games from the previous generation, it was a radical leap forward. When compared to today's standards, in certain regards it has aged gracefully, but in others, oh no. Playing on the PC, we have the benefit of a much higher resolution, which helps the game to some extent, but textures are very muddy by modern standards. Some of the interior texture sets, especially the dungeons, hold up pretty well, though they are being helped out by being shrouded in darkness. Parallax mapping lends them some extra fidelity, but certain stone textures take it way too far, shattering the illusion. Environmental textures in the cities and the overworld can look good from a distance, but up close they start to show their age. Weapons, armors, and items all range from okay to not good, depending on the items in question, and if you're using a third or first person perspective. A lot of the items lack luster and make the items seem to be made of plastic, and some of the details on the textures are just way too much for the low resolution and look like a noisy mess as a result. And distant landscapes look like oil paintings rather than real terrain, which in a way actually helps the game look more stylized, but we'll get back to that in a moment. Lighting, like textures, ranges in quality, but the limited number of shadows, particularly shadows cast by characters and items, really hampers the illusion of realism. In general, interiors have better lighting because you won't run into the limited number of dynamic sources and shadows as often, but it's still not great, and the omnipresent ambient lighting and fog really ruins the dungeon experience. You'll frequently find inexplicable pools of light from non-existent sources that are just there to keep the place looking bright. And I don't know why this is such a problem for the developers when we have so many ways of seeing in the dark. Oblivion has a dynamic weather system that helps add some liveliness to exterior locations. The rain and snow effects feel dated as the storms feel like monsoons the characters don't react to, and the snow, well, just look at it. It looks like a Snapchat photo filter. The flat fog effects are no bargain either. On occasion though, with the right stuff in the foreground at the right times of the day, inclement weather can do the trick. But it's the sunny weather, especially at sunrise and sunset, where the game really sparkles. This has to do with the saturated, more fantasy-like color palette they used, and this is on display when the sun is at more extreme angles in the sky. This is when the game feels picturesque, almost like you're living in a painting. This is where the things like muddy, distant landscapes can almost feel like it adds to that impression. Fortunately, the disappearance of distant trees and rocks and, well, everything else not part of the landscape geometry disrupts that impression to some extent. But the powerful colors and the heavy use of bloom does make this game look more stylized than I actually remembered it being. I'd be remiss though if I didn't mention the absolute worst part of Oblivion's graphics: NPCs. Monsters and creatures still look good, aside from maybe ghosts because they look like Scooby-Doo characters as opposed to something more grounded and freaky. But the wraiths make up for that missing horror element, and seeing as they replace ghosts after a certain level, it's almost a non-issue. NPCs that you interact with though, they all look like they share genetic material with garden variety vegetables. They all look lumpy and disfigured, like their skin is actually a hard plastic shell pressed over another person, but the shell's not the right size. Looks like these people had terrible skin conditions that someone tried airbrushing away. Their facial animations just convey no genuine human emotion despite being so emotive. It's uncanny and more often than not hilarious and unsettling. The problem can't be ignored either because the camera makes a really uncomfortable locked-in zoom on their face that freezes time, making it seem like they're some alien creature that has you ensnared in some evil spell, and isn't aware that the illusion of normalcy is failing to convince you. I'm probably making a bigger deal about this than I should be, But when a lot of your time is spent staring at these abused canvases of human flesh, it just can't be ignored. I think a lot of the blame lands with the character creator. The parameter of the sliders can be put to way too extreme of variables that no human could possibly exhibit under normal circumstances. I imagine this is the same tool the developers use to make NPCs, so when the tools make it easier to produce unnatural looking faces as opposed to natural ones, it explains why so many NPCs look like they just shouldn't exist. It's funny and amusing at times, but completely immersion breaking otherwise. All in all, as long as you aren't talking to an NPC, I say the game looks pretty good still. Looking deep reveals the flaws, but at face value when you're just wandering the land wagging your sword at some baddies, it holds up pretty well. The audio department of Oblivion is, like the graphics department, a mix of quality. Sound leaves a lot to be desired, while the soundtrack is nothing short of magnificent. But let's cover sounds first before I devolve into a drooling fanboy geeking out over the music. Sounds are most of them are fine. Swords hitting things are clangy enough, armor affects the sound of footsteps, weather effects are pretty decent but not too overwhelming to the point of drowning out all other sounds, and you'll sometimes hear birds chirping in the forest when you're wandering around. Some sounds, though, aren't the best. Magic effects seem to have more than a few that either don't match up with what I would expect a spell to sound like, or it's obnoxious, or it's both. Like NPC faces, it wouldn't even be worth mentioning if I didn't hear these sound effects constantly as a spellcaster. But moving on from perhaps my worst nitpick thus far, let's get into something less nitty. Voice acting. Oblivion has got a very bad rap for its voice acting, and some of it's deserved and some of it isn't. I really can't sit here and say there's a bad voice actor in the cast, especially considering the sheer number of characters and lines these people had to voice. I think their work goes largely unappreciated. No, the problem isn't the actors or their performances, it's just the fact that there's only like a couple dozen of them. A couple dozen people voice acting a cast that borders close to 1,000 individual NPCs that all have something to say. I'll get to the content of these conversations later in the video, but for now, I just want to discuss the quality of the acting and recording. It's good. We got a few A-list actors who fill in some of the key characters, including Patrick Stewart, whose voice is like Velvet, Sean Bean, who is Sean fucking Bean, and Terrence Stamp, whose performance of Mankar Cameron is the only saving quality of the main baddie of the main story.
So, the cat's paw of the Septims arrives at last. You didn't think you could take me unawares, here of all places, in the paradise that I created. Look now upon my paradise. Gaia Alata in the old tongue, a vision of the past and the future.
One thing to complain about when it comes to voice acting is the battle banter. When NPCs are engaged in combat, they will begin screaming random lines, and for some of the races, these lines are just maybe a tiny bit over the top.
Oh, what's the matter? Is the baby gonna cry? Now you will know pain!
The Imperial Guards in particular have some pent-up bloodlust they unleash when they are let off their leashes.
Then pay with your blood! Pay the fine! I fought mud crabs more fearsome than you. I'm just warning you, but that's the best you can do! Die! For the Empire! For the Empire! Pay the fine!
But all the races are plagued by a few takes that developers probably should have left out of the game files. But then we wouldn't have some of the best Oblivion memes, so who's to say?
Yes, we must kill that foul Nord before he slits our throats. Aye!
So many people...
Oblivion's original soundtrack is an hour-long composition by Jeremy Soule, encompassing 25 tracks. These songs are played in 3 distinct sections of gameplay: exploration, dungeon crawling, and combat, with the game's theme only being played at the main menu. By far, my favorite tracks are all the exploration ones. They are a perfect mix of woodwinds, brass strings, and light harmonic hymns that are all carefully balanced to prevent any set becoming too overpowering, fatigue, or boring. It's your usual fanfare when it comes to instruments, but it's how Soul uses these components to create tracks that are at both times emotionally evocative but emotionally neutral that is a really impressive feat. These songs all carry emotional elements that generally make the listener feel something, but it never tries telling the listener what to be feeling. Many of the songs can elicit from me feelings of peace, joy, and happiness, or they can make me feel wistful, forlorn, lonely, and sometimes just downright depressed. It's very difficult to make music that does that consistently, and the fact that every single one of the exploration tracks does this is a credit to Soul's skills as a composer. Of course, the soundtrack now strikes with me a lot of nostalgia, but that does wear off after a few hours in game, leaving me with nothing but a great appreciation for what the music was intended to do. The dungeon tracks are more ambient in nature and less neutral in tone, provoking feelings of general unease. While combat music is meant to signal you're in danger and provide a break from the peaceful exploration tracks to avoid dissonance from what you're hearing and what you're seeing. There's less to say about them, but they aren't bad, and they don't detract from the real GOAT tracks. The only problem I can say the soundtrack has nothing to do with Soul's work, and rather how the game engine handles playing the tracks. You'll be wandering the lands listening to some peaceful song when all of a sudden the horns of war start blaring, signaling you're under attack. So you'll stop in your tracks, spinning in circles looking for a troll to come barreling through the trees only to see it's a mud crab inching its way towards you in the least menacing way imaginable. So you just pop it with a fireball and the peaceful music comes back. It's really silly, and it makes it so that you end up gaming the music as a signal for anything that might be keeping you from fast traveling. Another problem will arise in the dungeon tracks, where brief stints of combat will cause the background ambient music to reset rapidly enough to show the seams of the tracks. It would have been better if the ambient tracks eased back in after like 30 seconds of silence following combat, just so it wouldn't be so obvious. But these are both only tiny complaints that Bethesda actually addresses in later games. I just needed something to complain about to restore the balance of this video's humors. For a lot of games, controls would fall under gameplay, which was my previous video. But I feel like the controls of Oblivion influence less of its gameplay and more of its presentation, and that plays an important role in the verisimilitude of Oblivion to increase the immersion and believability of its world and... okay. I really didn't think to address this until the gameplay video was edited, so I'm just putting it in here, but I'm not totally full of shit, I promise, just give me a chance to explain. So Oblivion is played in almost exclusively a first-person perspective, and while you can technically play it in third person, doing just about anything in that perspective is very challenging. And the janky character animations that do not match up with the precise player movement responses makes for some really unpleasant immersion-breaking things to start happening on screen. Third person is primarily for appreciating your patchwork of mismatched gear that has been chosen purely for their enchantments and not at all for their aesthetic qualities. The game was originally designed for controller use and it shows with the interface and hotkeys. The buttons are big, everything is sorted in tabs, and you are forced to do a ton of scrolling. There's no hotkeys for navigating the interface, which is nothing short of maddening for someone like me who prefers navigating everything with keyboard shortcuts whenever possible. The interface is an exercise of patience, particularly when you're managing your inventory, moving things in and out of storage containers and selling things to vendors. Navigating the map has me accidentally clicking map markers when I'm trying to pan the map because of course I can't use keys to pan the map. Certain actions, like dropping items or putting custom map markers, aren't even described in the keyboard shortcuts menu, and you either have to go looking them up online and hope you didn't rebind a key that makes those shortcuts wrong, or sit there testing key combinations until it works. Fortunately, when playing in the intended first-person perspective, wandering the world and engaging in combat with the mouse and keyboard is probably superior to using a controller. It's one of the most responsive ports I've ever played on PC, the movement being incredibly precise, unless you try jumping, in which case you run the risk of either breaking gravity and ending up in orbit, or being locked in place as you pathetically hop up and down. Sometimes you can strafe in midair, and sometimes you can't. I don't really know what determines when you strafe and when you can't. I know it's not random, but after thousands of hours in this game, I've yet to really deduce it. I think it has something to do with your third-person animations, but that's just a guess based on other games with this engine. But aside from jumping, snapping your camera with the mouse is very satisfying, especially gratifying for mages using targeted spells and marksmen using bows. It's exactly what I want from my mouse input. And being someone who plays with stupid high DPI settings, the game doesn't break or stutter. Although menus can feel slightly sluggish compared to player camera movement, it's not too bad though. But I want to focus on talking about that first-person perspective. There were quite a few subtle design choices Bethesda made with Oblivion, or rather with all their games in general, and the emphasis on first-person gameplay is an example of one of those choices. Bethesda has, on occasion, described their games as fantasy simulators rather than actual role-playing games. And while I was completely unaware of it at the time when I first played Oblivion in 2007, I can see where this line of reasoning comes from. Now, this could just be an argument of semantics. Maybe it's just an excuse Bethesda likes to pull to justify their weaker RPG mechanics while they build systems like Radiant AI and applying Havoc physics to all the items in their games. But I'd like to investigate this idea anyhow. The first-person camera gives you as grounded of a perspective as possible in Oblivion, allowing you to experience the world as just another person in that world. This is where that immersion factor so many players start chasing begins. Everything feels more visceral, from conversations and combat to strolling through town and being caught in a storm. Bethesda's level designers make a dedicated effort to populating the world with tons of clutter items like plates, food, bowls, weights, and scales. Everything is handcrafted to maintain that illusion of you being a part of this world. And aside from furniture and fixtures, these items can all be interacted with using a dedicated grab button, explosive magic, weapons, other objects, or running into them. The payoff is worth the effort in my opinion. If I played an Elder Scrolls game where I couldn't grief shopkeepers, it just wouldn't feel the same. It would feel a lot faker, and that immersion I need in order to buy into the world would take a hit. Now, there are plenty of things in Oblivion that shatter immersion, but I'm going to make an audacious claim here. Bethesda games are some of the most immersive games ever made. There, I said it. It's because they put so much time into these systems, and while some of them don't work right off the bat, and I will definitely be getting into those later in this video, I still appreciate Bethesda tried something that other developers would shy away from or just say isn't necessary. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Maybe there's cheaper and or more effective ways to fudge the realism and immersion, but I like Bethesda's approach. And I think it's a lot of these unique, sometimes quirky systems that give Bethesda games such a distinct identity. They feel like a Bethesda game, jank and bugs notwithstanding. It gives these games a very unique form of realism, something analogous to art style. I don't know, stylized immersion perhaps? But I've gone on long enough about something I didn't even intend on including in this series until I realized it was missing in my first video. So let's move on to what discussion of immersion and realism naturally leads into. The world of Oblivion. Before man came to rule Tamriel, and before the chronicles of the historians recorded the affairs of the rulers of Tamriel, the events of our world are known only through myths and legends, and through the divinely inspired teachings of the 9 divines. For convenience, historians divide the distant ages of prehistory into 2 broad periods of time, the Dawn Era and the Merethic Era. The Dawn Era is that period before the beginning of mortal time, when the feats of the gods take place. The Dawn Era ends with the exodus of the gods and magic from the world. The cosmos formed from the Orbis, chaos or totality, by Anu and Padamai. Akatosh formed and time began. The gods, Et Ada, formed. Lokren convinced or tricked the gods into creating the mortal plane, Nirn. An excerpt from Before the Ages of Man. The world Oblivion takes place in is a fascinating place, filled with a vast and rich background of history told through in-game books such as the one I just read an excerpt from. It's through a mix of these books, in-game dialogue, and story events that we are given access to it. While I feel the game could do a better job utilizing this lore more, it's not completely lost either, and I'd like to touch on some of it just to give some context for the actual game world we find ourselves lost in. Oblivion, as with all Elder Scrolls games, takes place on the planet Nirn, sometimes referred to as Mundus, which is a physical dimension in the planes of Oblivion, sort of primordial nothingness that all things are constituted in. Nirn, or Mundus, was created by the gods for mortals to live within, and now act as some sort of arena where the gods and the Daedra compete. Nirn is a magically charged realm, though a lot more tame than it had been during the time of the gods, where time itself was unstable. Tamriel is a continent on this planet and is where all of the games have taken place. Oblivion specifically takes place in the province of Cyrodiil, the metropolitan heartland of the Empire that governs the entire continent. Cyrodiil is a temperate province with miles of coastline, lush forests deeper in its interior, snowy mountains in the north, and marshlands to the south. Not only is the province the governing center of the empire, it's also the physical center of it, and as such, it's a major crossroads for travelers and traders. Once home to the now extinct elven race known as the Aelids, the province is now the home of a human race known as Imperials. The province is well developed with 9 distinct cities dotting its landscape, connected by a series of roads with a smattering of smaller towns, settlements, and farms throughout the countryside. Along with these civilized areas are numerous ruins of Aelid cities, old Imperial forts, caves, and mines that are usually inhabited by dangerous creatures or criminals. There's also many structures and shrines belonging to the gods, Daedric princes, Aelid magical wells, and various nondescript ruins and abandoned structures. The history of the province is rich and varied, marked by a lot of violence and tension. I won't go too deep into it, but the general premise is that the Aelids once claimed ownership of the province and had a very distinct and advanced society that eclipsed all other cultures on the continent, especially the newly arrived humans in the northern regions. Wars between men and elves, also known as Mer, resulted in a lot of hostility and the Aelids enslaving men in their empire. A slave uprising led to the toppling of the Elven Empire and the establishment of the human-led empire we see in the game itself. The Imperial City is taken as the capital for this new empire, with the Aelid White Gold Tower being converted to the Imperial Palace for the Empress and her descendants. The worship of the 8 divines is established, and the worship of the Daedra, the dominant religion of the hated Aelids, is outlawed. Over the centuries, the Aelids disappear from Tamriel, and the rule of the Emperors, while turbulent and violent, endures and eventually takes hold of the entire continent. The chronicling of history itself is dated in regards to the different dynasties that have ruled the empire since its founding. This ends up creating 3 distinct eras, dubbed the First, Second, and Third Era, with which the events of the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion mark the end of. The Emperors are partially divine and exclusively wield certain powers that protect the realms of men and Mer from subversive elements such as the Daedra. Basically, the Emperors are a really big deal, and the deaths of them can provoke serious crises if successors are not named. Which is exactly what happens 40 minutes into the opening of Oblivion, and kicks off the Oblivion invasion of Tamriel, which we'll get into later. Cyrodiil is only one of 9 provinces of the Empire. Each province is home to physiologically and culturally distinct races that are classified as either men, elves, or beast folk. These provinces range from the swamps of Black Marsh in the southeast, to the forests of Valen Wood in the west, to the snowy mountains of Skyrim in the north, and the rugged temperate region of High Rock to the northwest. All of these provinces, their denizens, and their unique cultures all have an influence in Cyrodiil and is reflected in its architecture, culture, laws, customs, religion, and social norms. With that winded detour, I think it's safe to say I've given enough background to take a deeper dive into the components that Bethesda used to create the game world of Oblivion. I didn't pay much attention to any of this when I first started playing Oblivion, and the game plays well enough without any of that context. But it's there to be exploited, and I think it breathes some more life into this world if the player understands the foundations it's built upon. Like I said earlier, Cyrodiil is populated by many different races, all of whom you can play as when you're creating your character. They influence some starting stats and favored skills. Elves are more magic, beast folk tend to be stealthy, humans are typically fighters, but it's not the end of the world making a high elf barbarian warrior. The Imperials I covered to some extent already. They are the primary inhabitants of Cyrodiil and are considered skilled merchants and diplomats, but also well balanced for combat and magic. They may be considered the dominant race of Tamriel and Oblivion, as they sit on the Imperial throne, and it's their politics, culture, and military that dominates the continent. Continuing with the human races, we next have the Nords, who primarily live in the snowy region of Skyrim to the north. They typically make excellent warriors, favoring melee weapons and armor, and are very tolerant to cold temperatures. They are known to be proud and independent-minded, and are very loyal to their homeland and their religion. To the west of Skyrim is Hammerfell, the ancestral homeland of the Redguards. Redguards tend to make great warriors favoring swords. The Redguards are considered relative newcomers to Tamriel, having emigrated when their homeland literally sunk into the sea, and they were forced to sail east until they landed in Hammerfell, where they carried out a series of attacks on the coast to establish their own settlements. Northwest of Hammerfell is High Rock, home of the Bretons. Bretons are a human-elf mix that leaves them looking like humans, though smaller in build and much more magically tuned. They make great defensive mages thanks to their many resistances to magical effects. Their homeland is diverse and split into many competing factions, but regardless, they're culturally homogenous. The Bossamer, or Wood Elves, are, as the name suggests, an elven race. The quick, nimble, and intelligent elves, while small in stature, make some of the finest archers and sneaks in the Empire. Hailing from their homeland of Valen Wood in the southwest, Wood Elves are known for their love of nature and forests, and in Valen Wood, the forests are sacred and protected, leading to some very strange customs by the standards of other races. Valen Wood is technically not even part of the Empire during the events of Oblivion, though they aren't actively fighting against the Empire either. The province is in turmoil, and a stable central political power is non-existent there, as many broke off into simple, reclusive tribes instead. Off the southern coast of Tamriel is the island of Somerset, where the Ultimate or High Elves live. These elves, like all other elves, can live twice or 3 times as long as humans, and have a natural affinity for magic. They consider themselves culturally superior to all other races on the continent, and the culture has had a profound impact across Tamriel. Being naturally gifted with magic, they typically make excellent mages, though they also have a natural weakness to magic as well. They are the descendants of the Aldmer, making them the oldest races on Tamriel. The Dark Elves, or Dunmer, are the final elven race inhabiting Tamriel. They are noted for their dark skin and red eyes, and are distrustful of others to a fault, making them very factious and ensuring that they don't gain much clout in the Empire. This has led to several incidents of violence between Dunmer factions and between their homeland of Morrowind and surrounding provinces. Dark Elves, like all elves, are naturally gifted with magic, but they also possess great martial skills, making them very well balanced with magic, sword, and bow. This just leaves the beast races, which tend to be the favorites of the Elder Scrolls fans, and for good reason. They're just plain cool. Orcs are the only race not to actually have their own province, though not for lack of trying. Originally from the Rothgarian Mountains in High Rock, they have moved their capital of Orsinium many times, as the city has been sacked by other races. Initially feared and hated by the other races, they've grown to become at least somewhat respected and tolerated, as they've proven quite loyal to the Empire. Regardless, they are still looked down upon and treated with mistrust. They are known to be excellent warriors gifted with incredible speed, strength, endurance, and stamina, as well as making gifted smiths. The Khajiit, a race of bipedal cat-like people, occupies the province of Elsewhere in the south. They are intelligent and quick on their feet, making them great at stealth. They also possess some strength, making them competent with swords too. The Khajiit tend to be split into 2 distinct groups in their homeland: the nomadic people of the northern deserts and the culturally affluent city dwellers of the jungles in the south. Regardless of their group, Khajiit have a taste for moon sugar, an addictive mind-altering substance that they consume regularly. This has led to the development of a black market and a less than favorable reputation among the other races of Tamriel. And finally, we have the Argonians, a bipedal race of amphibious reptiles. Argonians call the swampy woods of Blackmarsh home and are notoriously secretive, with little being known about their homeland. Their extreme defense of their homeland has earned them possibly the worst reputation of the other races in Tamriel, although they possess a very rich culture. Still, their ties with the Empire are tenuous at best. With all attempts to colonize or fully subjugate the province ending in total failure, the Argonians are given a certain degree of autonomy, although slave trade is rife in the province as well. Argonians are known for their ability to breathe underwater and resistances to all poisons and diseases. They are nimble and stealthy, making great thieves and assassins. And that just about covers each of the 10 races of Oblivion, at least in a brief and superficial way. Oblivion definitely plays into the more typical fantasy tropes of applying broad characteristics to the different races in its world. And on the surface it does seem pretty generic, but when players start digging into the lore, they can find a wealth of canon that fleshes out these characters more. Just as the continent of Tamriel is divided into provinces, the province of Cyrodiil is also subdivided into distinct and varied regions or climates. The Nibene Basin is a vast hilly and forested region in the east part of the province, known for its many rivers and farms. The Heartlands is, as the name might suggest, at the center of the province, dominated by the Imperial City and the Great Bay surrounding it, making it a perfect natural harbor for trading, travel, and fishing. The Great Forest is, like the Nibene Basin, a vast forest to the west of the Imperial City. It's flatter, allowing for more farms and settlements as compared to the Nibene Basin. The Colovian Highlands is a wooded, mountainous region in the northwest corner of the province. Its sparser trees and wide grasslands make for great hunting grounds. The Westweald on the central southern border of Cyrodiil is a wooded countryside with many vineyards and farms. The Gold Coast is the coastal region on the far western shores of the province, dotted with imperial forts and harbors. The Jarl Mountains in the extreme north of the province is a harsh, rugged, and cold environment that forms a natural border with the province of Skyrim. Like the Jarl Mountains, the Vallis Mountains in the extreme east form another natural border with the province of Marwyn, but unlike the Jarls, the Vallis aren't snow-capped. Finally, there is Blackwood, a swampy region that straddles between the borders of Elsewhere and Blackmarsh and creates a narrow waterway between the Niben Bay and the Topal Bay. Because Bethesda seems to have a love for the number 9, 9 provinces, 9 gods, 9 regions of Cyrodiil, there are 9 cities in Cyrodiil, although one is a smoking ruin when you find it. The cities are spread across the map, occupying unique locations, all of them sporting a distinct style of architecture and general vibe. For the sake of injecting some of my opinion back into this video, I'm going to introduce them in the order of my least favorite to my most favorite. Kvatch is first and worst on this list, and there's truly not much to say about it as the city is destroyed the moment you come across it. In all honesty, it earns this spot by default, as it just has absolutely nothing in it aside from a couple of story-related quests and nothing else. When going through the city during the Siege of Kvatch quest, you get hints at what the city once was, and it must have been a really big city as it even had its own arena, something only the Imperial City has. It's a shame we never get the city intact during the game because I get the feeling it would have been a lot higher on my list if it hadn't been, but there's no sense in crying over that. Breville is a poor, filthy slum on the banks of the Niben Bay. A collection of shanties are placed in a somewhat disorganized manner, encircled by walls familiar to all cities in Cyrodiil. Overlooking it is a castle separated from the town by a small river. Dominating the northwest corner of the town is the Great Chapel of Mara, and a bit further from that is the only unique characteristic of Breville, the lucky old lady statue. There's not a whole lot to say about the town, but if you want to roleplay a degenerate thief or a skooma addict, it definitely would complement that lifestyle. It's got only one quest that I would say is interesting, leaving very little reason to visit the city that much. Bruma comes in at number 7 on this list. Bruma is a mostly Nord town in the northern regions of the Jarl Mountains. Its buildings are mostly made of thick logs and stone half buried in the ground to retain heat. Having been built on a mountain, the city is structured on tiers of elevations like steps leading up to the castle. It's a cool layout, but there's very little reason to visit Bruma aside from the occasional guild or story quest. I've always found Nords obnoxious, and a whole city to them makes it one of the most personally unappealing places in Oblivion. Next up is Chorrol at number 6. Chorrol isn't a bad city, but it's definitely bland. The city is ensconced in the Great Forest west of the Imperial City, laid out on a flat piece of land with many trees surrounding it. The city is split into 3 avenues from the main gate. The left avenue heading west towards the chapel and the residential district, the north avenue heading towards the roundabout where the guild halls are, and their eastern avenue heading towards the castle. The city holds 2 notable landmarks, the first being a statue of a woman holding a fallen warrior, and the second being the great oak that is the town's sigil. Chorrol has an interesting architecture with particularly nice interiors. It's also the de facto home of the Fighters Guild, as the main hall is located here. Chorrol also has some decent side quests, justifying visiting it quite often. Its simple layout, although a little dull, does make it extremely easy to navigate. Cheydinhal lands at number 5, and this is where I think the cities start to get interesting. Cheydinhal is located in the northeast part of Cyrodiil, resting on the foothills of the Vallis Mountains close to the Marwyn border. As a result, Cheydinhal has a large population of Dunmer. The city is split in 2 by the Corbola River, and linked together by 3 bridges, creating 2 distinct districts on the east and west banks, with the castle dominating the north side of town. The architecture of Cheydinhal is absolutely its greatest strength, making the city one of the most visually appealing in the game. It's very distinct and suits the environment perfectly, creating this sense of beauty that's meant to hide something more sinister. And this is absolutely the case, as the Dark Brotherhood's main sanctuary is located here, and the Mage Guild is headed by a necromancer. The interiors are equally as wonderful, with their vaulted ceilings and small footprints that lead to intricate layering of floors. I wish there was more content in this city, as its quest content is really sparse, but I love visiting Cheydinhal regardless. At the southernmost tip of Cyrodiil is Leyawiin, where the Niben River exits into the Topal Bay. Unlike its nearby neighbor, Breville, Leyawiin is a relatively prosperous town, and it's also pretty big. The city hosts a large population of Argonians and Khajiit, automatically making it a pretty cool place to be. The city is laid out in a grid pattern that actually makes it more confusing to navigate than any of the other cities, because each corner looks very similar, and it's easy to get turned around if there are no landmarks within sight. The architecture of the city I find to be very pleasing. The large, colorful plaster buildings in the middle of this dense swamp reminds me of New Orleans, and grants the city an incredible character. There's admittedly little to do in the city and not much brings you here, but the charm of its layout and buildings makes wandering it so nice that it earned the number 4 spot largely off that merit alone. Anvil places at number 3. Located on the Gold Coast at the extreme western edge of Cyrodiil, Anvil is a harbor town through and through. It's one of the smallest cities, possibly the smallest, as it only consists of like 8 houses and 2 guild halls. With that said, it's also one of the most distinctive in appearance, and the city is spread between a couple of loaded zones, with the main city behind the walls and the harbor district outside. This makes the town feel much larger and let the designers make each district feel very unique with numerous landmarks. I absolutely love the architecture of the city, which feels very nautical, with the interiors feeling like you're actually inside the hull of a ship as opposed to being on land. It's a great city with a definite theme loaded with fantastic quests. The castle doesn't feel out of place as it does in many other cities. And the city even has a lighthouse. It's surrounded by some of the prettiest landscapes in the game, and I absolutely love visiting it. This isn't a Top X video, so I'm not going to beat around the bush for number 2. It's Skingrad. Let me tell you about Skingrad. The city falls halfway between the Imperial City and Anvil along the Gold Road in the Oblivion region. In terms of geography, it's probably the most boring of all the cities, but it makes up for that with its surrounding vineyards that makes it feel like an actual city. You don't even need to enter the city to tell it's different from the rest. The large Gothic spires that are the hallmark of the city's architecture lines the city walls themselves, and inside the city you get the sense this place is absurdly rich and more than a little bit dark, twisted, and dangerous. And let me tell you how dark, twisted, and dangerous. First off, the Count is a fucking vampire. In a Gothic-styled city known for its wines and wealth, it's probably a bit cliche that this is going to be a vampire city, but I don't fucking care. Just look at the castle looming over the city like a menacing cloud. And with all sorts of rumors coming out of the place, it definitely looms in the minds of the Skingrad residents too. Like Anvil, the castle isn't actually attached to the city but separate, with a large stone bridge lined by torches and built atop these arches that would absolutely intimidate anyone who had to cross it. Skingrad means business, and I love that it's reflected so perfectly in the architecture. But going back down to the city itself, it's a very wealthy commercial town, split in half by the Gold Road itself, which provides a lot of its income as all trade along the road flows right through the city. The northern part of the city is mostly commercial, with the guild halls also being situated there, while the southern half is residential with the Great Chapel of Julianos overlooking a collection of mansions. The city is easy to navigate, but laid out well enough to make it feel quite large, and the massive buildings pressing against the narrow streets instill a sense that this is a very well developed town, and space within the walls is at a premium. There's plenty of landmarks to keep you situated so you're never lost, and they help reinforce the character of the city. Then we get into quests, which are mostly related to the guilds or the purchasable manor. But there is one that is standalone, and well, there's a reason a lot of people consider it the best side quest in the entire game. Paranoia fits perfectly with the rest of the city and is a one-of-a-kind quest in Oblivion.
I'll pay you. Gold. You like gold, don't you? Lots of gold.
The city also has a resident necrophile who has an intriguing backstory and some great dialogue.
Let's assume... no. That's nothing compared to Morrowind, thanks.
Rosethorn Manor is the biggest and most expensive house in the game, and it's probably the only other house I buy in the game after getting the waterfront shack, because using it as a base of operations isn't a total chore like many of the other houses. It's at the center of town, close to the shops, and only a few feet from the fast travel point. It's nice and big, making you feel like you've actually accomplished something in the game. It's time to leave Skingrad behind and talk the Imperial City, which is obviously number 1 thanks to the process of elimination. I didn't want to rank the Imperial City as the best in the game, as it feels like the city has an unfair advantage since each district feels like a city itself. But if I'm going off of objective metrics like time spent in a city, then the Imperial City takes it in a landslide. The amount of time I spend here is easily more than every other city combined, and that's because it really just has it all. The Imperial City sits at the center of Cyrodiil, making it pretty much the physical center of the Empire as well. Its Romanesque architecture also bears heavy fantasy elfin tones that are meant to highlight the history of the city itself. At its center lies the White Gold Tower, which can be seen from miles away in many parts of the province. It's an imposing symbol of the Empire's power, although it was in fact built by the aliens. But the Empress Alicia jacked it during her uprising, and it's been the home of the Imperial family ever since. The rest of the city is built around the tower in concentric rings in a manner that is distinctly not human. When viewed from above, the symmetry of the city's design only further alludes to a style that is not in line with the very imperfect empire the city governs. Within the main walls are 7 distinct districts, while 3 other districts jut off of it like spokes of a wheel. Green Emperor Way is the district surrounding the Imperial Palace. Aside from the tower itself, A ring of gardens, tombs, and graves runs along the entire perimeter, with gates leading to every other district of the city. It gives a sense of being at the center of the universe while recognizing the cost it took for that to be. The Market District, which is the main commercial hub of the city, is pretty much my home every time I play this game. I'm here all the time, selling things, managing equipment, leveling up, and planning what to do next, and sometimes just jumping around wasting time. The Arena District houses the Colosseum-inspired arena where many of my characters get their start. The Arboretum is a nice garden with statues dedicated to the gods. No reason to visit, but it adds some character to the city for sure. The Temple Plaza District is where the Temple of the One is located, where emperors light the dragon fires as part of their coronation. There's plenty of houses to break into if you're a thief, and a few quests to take you to this district, but that's about it. The Talos Plaza District is where the rich people of the Imperial City live. Tons of swanky houses you can rob as a thief, and a rather large and luxurious hotel in the center overlooking the dragon statue. It's a cool location I like visiting on occasion, but there's almost no reason to come here aside from a couple of quests and sightseeing. This is really where the most expensive house in the game ought to have been. The Elven Garden District is the main residential district of the city. There's really nothing remarkable here, as barely any quests ever steer you in its direction. It's just a place a lot of Imperial City residents go to sleep at night. The Arcane University hosts a lot of very useful magical services, and aside from the Market District is my second most visited place in the Imperial City. It's a beautiful location that blends seamlessly with the rest of the city's vibe, although a little muted in its magical qualities. The Imperial Prison is where you go if you're caught committing crimes in the Imperial City. It's supposed to be an inescapable fortress, but we as the player slip in and out of it more often than a lusty Argonian maid, so it can't be that impregnable. The Waterfront District is the port of the city and doubles as a slum where the city's poor live in wooden shacks on the banks of Lake Rumer. Seeing as I prefer the convenience of having my house close to my shops, this makes the shack on the waterfront my preferred player-owned dwelling, even if it's a rundown piece of shit. While technically not a district of the city, I like to consider the Dragon Bridge and the collection of inns and houses at its end to be a part of the city. There's a couple of quests here, and it's a neat little place that makes the city feel like a part of the world and not just this isolated patch of civilization in the middle of a lake. It keeps the city from feeling completely artificial, even though it's hard to shake that feeling entirely given its flawless geography. There's also a massive network of sewers beneath the city that you can get lost in for hours, and I guess that could count as a district if you want an even 12 districts. And that there is a description of every notable location in the city, some of them being almost as big and detailed as the smaller cities in the game. Added together, the city is an absolute juggernaut that must have taken as much time to create as all the other cities combined. Going through all the quests and content that intersects with the city is a fool's errand because it's the main city of the game for a reason. It would be exceedingly difficult to do a playthrough where you never set foot in the city, and even if you managed to pull it off, you'd have a very incomplete experience of the game. Because of that, I gotta say it's my favorite city in the game, and probably my favorite city of any game. It's just too damn difficult to try and top the Imperial City. But there's one last piece of the city experience I gotta cover. Talked about their art styles, their design, their utility, their shops, their quests, their points of interest, but I haven't yet discussed their people. Okay, there's this thing in Oblivion called Radiant AI. For the uninformed, this is a system Bethesda developed for their NPCs. They are programmed behavior packages that tell NPCs to do things like eat, sleep, go to work, socialize, or walk halfway across the world because a certain flag isn't set correctly. Rather than having NPCs that stand in the same spot day in and day out, rain or shine. Bethesda set out to give these characters lives of their own by building this system and having as much tie into it as possible. I gotta give them credit for trying something so ambitious, and continuing to refine it with each release since Oblivion. It's a pretty cool system, but it was perhaps a little undercooked when it came time to ship Oblivion, and it yielded some interesting consequences. A typical Oblivion NPC's day goes something like this. Wake up in their assigned bed in their own house, eat something they might have picked up from their cupboard, table, or from what they had in their inventory. Then it's off to work at their shop across town, which they will walk to. There, they will stand and conduct business with the player because the player is the only entity in the world capable of actually performing monetary transactions. If the player doesn't come by, then they are just going to stand there staring ahead for several hours. If the shopkeep has other shopkeeps they run the store with, then they might fill the time with discussing the goings-ons of the world. Then it's time to close up shop and head out to get something to eat from the nearby inn. There, they might strike up conversations with other NPCs, or they might chat with someone on the street as they walk home. At home, it's free time, which can be spent reading or staring at a wall for a couple of hours, because I know I like to stare at walls for fun. Then bedtime. Repeat until the end of time. It's impressive that Bethesda managed to get all this running for almost 1,000 NPCs in all the cities and settlements across the game world, even if it's only an approximation of a life being lived. You can absolutely stalk NPCs to see what they're doing, but doing so is going to expose their empty robotic lives for what they truly are. An illusion for the player's egocentricity. Unfortunately, you don't have to stalk NPCs for the flaws in the systems to really begin to show. You'll constantly hear NPCs having conversations that sound like two search engines attempting human discourse. You'll see NPCs standing around lifeless because something interrupted their programmed ritual and a refresh tick hasn't passed yet to reorientate them. You'll see NPCs pathfind in strange and inexplicable ways. You'll see NPCs get stuck and just disappear from the game entirely until you find and unstuck them. You'll see all sorts of quirky behavior constantly. And even if everything is running perfectly, the illusion is so paper thin that it fails to convince, and in fact only reminds me I'm playing a game from 2006 and these are not real people. The cities feel so dead, and the feeling is amplified by the larger cities. The Imperial City is supposed to be a bustling megacity, but it's got as many people walking its streets as Burville, which is a squalid backwater. Nobody is coming and going in the cities aside from a very few NPCs, some of whom actually are suffering from malfunctioning Radiant AI routines. How they go about fulfilling their pre-programmed needs might deviate somewhat from picking food from their kitchen table to picking food from an outdoor container on the street. But that's not something that's going to intrigue me. I'd be more interested if I saw an NPC from Anvil suddenly in the Imperial City doing some shopping because the shops in her city don't carry the goods she is looking for. It would be interesting if I saw a group of NPCs, all friends with each other, meeting up at the pub for some ale on the weekend. Shit, we don't even have weekends in Cyrodiil. I mean, like, what if we had festivals and holidays like Stardew Valley? That'd be cool. Most of these generic NPCs won't have anything new to discuss whether you are an hour into your playthrough or 100 hours in. They might just blurt out a different generic line that you heard from 10 other people already. They gain no insight from their uniquely programmed lives, and if they aren't changing, then their lives are nothing but purgatory stasis. Radiant AI, which is intended to make the cities feel more alive, oftentimes have the reverse effect. It reminds me that I'm the only one with self-awareness in this world, and once I start to realize that, I stop seeing these characters as people. And then when they do, very, very rarely, express opinions, I don't care in the slightest because the illusion was lost, and I'm left with nothing more but to cast Touch of Rage and make them murder each other for my own sick amusement. Please, let's just get out of the cities. I don't like it here anymore. Now it's time for all these disparate pieces of Oblivion's world building I've been rambling on about for a half hour come together to create an experience. This experience is a gameplay loop built upon many layers of interconnecting systems that offers a large degree of player autonomy. It could be said that Bethesda doesn't create games, but instead creates worlds that then have gameplay mechanics layered on top of them, and then some quests and objectives sprinkled in. It's this layered series of systems that each player is dropped into and told to do what they want. This is why I think it's not inaccurate when Bethesda says that these are fantasy simulators more than role-playing games. The funny thing is that in isolation there really isn't a single component in Oblivion that is spectacular. Well, barring one exception. Let me explain. Starting with the lore and history, there's a ton of lore and backstory that you can get lost in on the wiki. In-game, the vast majority of this is crammed into little books that are scattered all over the world. Most of it is very easy to miss, and regardless, a lot of it goes unutilized. Knowing it definitely gives some greater context for the world and why it is the way it is, but Bethesda is not above just retconning things if it doesn't work for the game. For example, Cyrodiil was actually described in previous games' lore as being a lush jungle, but obviously in Oblivion it's a temperate climate. They worked some retconning to explain why it is, but it's kinda lame. If the authors of the lore aren't going to respect the lore and the rules of their own universe, why should I care about learning it in the first place? Okay, maybe that's a nihilistic perspective, and Cyrodiil not being a jungle doesn't keep me from reading up on Elder Scrolls lore, but you get my point. Unless the game is going to make good use of what is written in these books, the information contained within does a little more than act as some food for thought as I'm wading through monotonous dungeons. And don't worry, I'm gonna be getting to the dungeons soon enough. First, let's discuss the races again. The races are all very interesting, with their own unique cultures that Bethesda allows to poke through on very rare occasions. But for the vast majority of your time spent in Cyrodiil, you don't really notice a difference between the races aside from their appearance and a few lines of generic dialogue. Nords like to mention wind, Argonians speak of water a lot, and Khajiits like to talk of sand. That's really all it ends up boiling down to, and that's a damn shame. Cyrodiil is meant to be the cosmopolitan heart of the Empire, a great melting pot of cultures, religions, languages, and histories. It's meant to be a cultural and economic crossroad for a continent-spanning empire, but you just never get that sense when playing Oblivion. Melting pot countries tend to be very dynamic, very diverse, and most importantly, very contentious societies. None of these hold true for Cyrodiil. Members of different races rarely make mention of their cultures, and you aren't able to probe them for even the most basic information. And none of it is reflective in their domiciles, businesses, places of respite, and places of worship. It's just the same bland, homogenous imperial decor that leads you to believe that even the free-spirited Khajiits have had the love of their culture pressed out of them by the mechanisms of empire. And you know what? That would actually be an incredible starting point for some cultural conflict in these cities. Maybe the Khajiit and Argonians in Leyawiin, which had been ceded to the Empire, chafe under the imperial norms and complain how things are done in town. That gives you the potential to interact with the lore, learn more in an organic and more engaging way than just reading books, and have some interesting quest content that breathes more life into a world that feels oppressively static. While we're on the subject of cities, let's criticize the cities. While I appreciate the unique art styles of each city, and aside from a couple, don't really have a problem with the sizes or layouts, they just don't have much going on for them. In terms of straight gameplay, nothing beats the Imperial City, and even for the Imperial City, you won't venture beyond the Market District as it has the most wealthiest vendors by magnitudes. They are all in a perfect, easy to understand grid layout, and can be done unloading your loot from dungeons and quests, have all your gear repaired and recharged, and loaded back up with potions and empty soul gems in a matter of minutes. No other city can compete with that sort of convenience, and because of that, and the fact that there aren't many quests in the other cities, especially when you disqualify the guild quests, there are some cities you simply will never set foot in unless you make a concerted effort to do so. It is probably the worst of Bethesda's missed opportunities, because these cities have such incredible atmosphere that could naturally lend each of them to their very own unique quest chains that could all be memorable affairs. Really, the missed opportunities of these cities hurt me the most. Seeing as I'm in the complaining mood now, I guess it's time to discuss the dungeons. Oh no, not the dungeons. For better or for worse, Oblivion has over 200 different dungeons open to be explored, not counting all the camps and unlocked things to find in the overworld. Or the Oblivion Gates if you think that's content worth counting. We can't talk about exploration in the game without talking about the dungeon crawls, which, by Todd Howard's own admission, was a big focus of Oblivion. The results of which are, like anything else in this game, a mixed bag of good and not so. There's no doubt that when it came to the dungeons, Bethesda went with a quantity over quality approach, and while it didn't help make a lot of them feel unique, it did help make the world feel less empty, so I understand why they did it. The dungeons are, in fact, handcrafted, not generated like some people believe. It only feels like they were generated because the designers used pre-made dungeon pieces that would then snap together like an IKEA cabinet. They can mix and match different pieces, but ultimately there's only so many ways you can make a cave from a handful of parts. This leads to a lot of the dungeons visually blending together, leading almost none of them to feeling unique or memorable. There are mainly 4 types of dungeons: caves, mines, imperial forts, and my personal favorite, Ayleid ruins. Technically there's 5 if you count Oblivion Gates, but they are just so bad and are only open during a certain stretch of the main quest, so I'm just going to ignore them. Okay? Okay. Caves are incredibly dull, with the least amount of variation in their design. Very monotonous art styles, and the layouts almost always lead to getting lost and looking for a random hidden offshoot you missed 3 times, leading you to backtrack and double backtrack. Mines are caves, but with rocks you can loot for ore. Usually shorter, but are also guilty of having even more branching paths that are incredibly easy to miss if you're going too fast or get sucked into a fight. Imperial forts is where it starts to get interesting for me. They are more visually stimulating, usually involving some traps to keep you on the lookout, and have more straightforward layouts that keep you from getting hopelessly lost. Sometimes they just come to an abrupt end, and you're forced to turn around and backtrack for 5 minutes to the exit. All in all, they aren't terrible, and I'll usually explore every inch of them and mostly enjoy my brief time in them. Coming to Ayleid ruins, which, like I said, are my favorite of the 4 types. Right off the bat, their exteriors are usually quite distinct and interesting. It's satisfying to be tromping through the forest and suddenly coming across the crumbling, stained ruins of one of these ancient cities. They really add to the wonder of exploring the overworld, and I can't help but feel that old familiar itch in my nucleus accumbens when I imagine what fatty loot is stored within. So I usually take the plunge and head inside. The interiors are like the exteriors, unlike anything else you'll find in Oblivion. The white stone walls stretch up to the pitch-dark ceilings, and while some of the archways have a questionably familiar shape to them, The architecture feels quite alien and elfin, which makes sense, these places were built by elves. I might start thinking about how these places might have once looked centuries ago when they were used as cities for the elves, but that's more an exercise in futility because there's no way these spaces could have been utilized for sophisticated living quarters. Bethesda designed them to be combat arenas, not to represent actual cities. They feel more like enigmatic temples or something, as opposed to cities, but whatever, I guess that's just me being pedantic. The ruins are laid out in a series of interconnected chambers that twist and turn and layer on top of each other, branch off into different loaded zones, and can sometimes lead back to their beginning or just end abruptly, necessitating more backtracking. Their layouts can be horribly confusing, and even with the map I find myself easily getting lost in some of the bigger ones. It's not too bad though, because unlike all the other dungeons, the interior scenery is incredibly varied, with enigmatic pieces of architecture and magical technology that keeps each room feeling fresh. Although you will see repeats of chambers the more ruins you do explore. These chambers are riddled with traps that will more often than not just scare the ever-living fuck out of you as opposed to killing you outright, because you'll be walking along and suddenly your character will break the dead silence with an ear-splitting yelp as a trap blade whooshes behind you. The dungeons wind up putting stress on some of the weakest parts of Oblivion, as exploring these repetitive spaces yields very little reward in terms of lore, knowledge, story, or even interesting and unique scenery. That would be all fine and dandy if combat was particularly fun and challenging, but it's not, resulting in dungeons feeling bland and repetitive if experienced for an extended period of time. The only thing that prolongs the experience for me and what kept me grinding through them when I was much younger is the behavioral conditioning I experienced from the Skinner box design of the loot system. You kill things and get some loot. Kill more things, get more loot. Level up and get better loot. Sometimes that loot is enchanted, and that's when we got a real party going. Hit chests, get bonus loot. Hit bigger chests, get bigger loot. Find a coffin, loot that bitch too. Pick magical stones off their pedestals and sell them. Loot everything. Chug feather potions, don gear you enchanted with only strength buffs, cast a feather spell, hoof it back to the market district to pawn it all for sweet, sweet gold. Rinse, repeat. Strip those dungeons down to the studs, leave nothing behind. Did I mention dungeons reset after 3 days? For someone like me who has an addiction to amassing wealth and loot, this is an easy thing for me to fall prey to. But those cheap thrills don't really last for long, because as I said in my previous video, the money has nowhere to go, making the accumulation of wealth pretty much useless. When it wears off, I'm only left with boredom that has me looking for the quit to desktop button. And I can't shake the feeling that's like when you hang out with old friends you haven't seen in years, and after an hour you remember why you haven't talked to them in so long. You haven't changed, they haven't changed, the things you all do haven't changed, and the places you visit hasn't changed. Nothing has changed. The only thing that has changed is that you've forgotten. That's the feeling prolonged dungeon diving fills me with in Oblivion. It's not a fun feeling. So why do I think exploration is still one of the strongest arms of Oblivion? Well, that's because this feeling starts to set in after a few hours of dungeon diving. There comes a point where the monotony sets in and the experience devolves into a grind whose fruits are worthless in the short and long term. Taken in small, concentrated doses, exploration can actually be enjoyable. In fact, that whole philosophy can be applied to the entire game. But we'll get back to that. First I want to talk about what part of exploration never really tires. The overworld is a term I've thrown around a few times and have yet really to define. It refers to any space that is not a city, interior, or dungeon. It's the wilderness that connects all the locations of the game space. Exploring this area is an absolute joy because it's full of unique and changing scenery. You can cross the Dragon Bridge a dozen times during different days and weather, and it feels like you're seeing something completely new each time. You'll occasionally get ganked by roaming enemies, and if you're in a hurry that can be annoying. But if you're not going anywhere in particular, it's a welcome diversion. Sometimes the enemy will draw you in a direction that you would not have normally gone, usually off the beaten path, leading you to some captivating scenery or some point of interest. This is where Bethesda's world design is at its best. Even without the compass, you will feel like the game is pulling you in a dozen directions with promises of something interesting to see just over the next hill or through a patch of trees. This is exploration at its best, exploring for the sake of exploring. You're exploring for the intrinsic value of discovery because you don't need a thinly veiled Skinner box to get your dopamine flowing. You just need some stimulation, any stimulation. The rest of the game lacks this sort of diversity, this sort of liveliness. The cities manage to feel dull and dead in comparison, despite being full of NPCs who are going about their programmed lives. The quests lack any sort of thrust or emotional investment. Leveling and progression feels flat and unrewarding, but despite all these faults, It's this, just wandering through the wilderness of Cyrodiil that is just so goddamn good that it literally carries the entire fucking game on its back. It does it so subtly that I take it for granted sometimes, and it's easy for players to miss when they are fast traveling between quest markers. But this exploration is where the magic of the game resides. When everything is working right, the experience of roaming the countryside, taking in the beautiful sights that are made more visceral and more real from the first-person perspective, while the time of the day progresses and Jeremy Soul's beautiful score plays in the background, it's just so easy to lose all sense of awareness. The world washes over you in a delightful wave, and you just feel good. You're simply having fun, simply enjoying this world. This is Bethesda magic. This is what you spend hours doing tedious dungeons and quests to get to. This is what an Elder Scrolls game is truly about. We don't need radiant AI, flat quests, boring dungeons, exploitable skills, and flimsy loot systems to appreciate this, although it would make for a better experience if these aspects of the games were improved upon. But there is a way to get more out of this game than the average player might get, a way to distill the experience down to a purer form. Moderation is key to the Oblivion experience. Do any one thing for too long and the mask starts to slip. You start to see behind the curtain and you notice all the machinery that is running in the background to create this fantasy simulator. And that's a serious problem. In my opinion, a good simulation should be able to withstand the most rigorous scrutiny imaginable. A simulation is meant to simulate an aspect of reality, and in order for that to be achieved, it needs to do it near 100% of the time. Otherwise, you start sliding into the realm of RPGs, and Oblivion just doesn't play very well as an RPG. So what's the deal here? Oblivion isn't a great exclusively RPG experience, and it's not consistent enough with its systems to qualify as a simulation. What does that make it then? Well, that makes it a game that lands somewhere between RPG and sim. Not a very satisfying answer, I know, but that's all I can really come up with. The secret to getting the most out of the game is to avoid looking at things too deeply in order to preserve the sanctity of its sandbox simulation, and to cut its slack when you see those faults because it's an RPG. I don't know, I'm no psychologist, but it sounds to me like this game is awfully needy. Oblivion is not without its flaws, and it's weird that a game that tries to be about exploration and player freedom ends up having a lot of quirks that constantly play against those two foundations. But when all is well, exploring and experiencing this unique world can be very satisfying. Anyway, that's all I have to say about exploration. I'll see you in the next one.